I've been a graphic designer for nearly 40 years. Most of my work still fits solidly within that category of graphic design, these days mostly in book design and design education. But in the last several years, I've been steering my practice towards a deep interest in photography, and it's that shift that I want to talk to you about this morning. Now, photography has been a part of my life since I was very young. My dad was a wedding photographer, and I grew up with a darkroom as a normal component of a household. Now, this is not going to be a presentation to really offer advice or to give you a proper game plan to do something like this. I've never been able to strategically plan my own career. I've stumbled into most opportunities, and most of the changes in my work have been accidental and unexpected. So when I say steer, don't think that I even know where the road is. All I can say is that I can see a little ways ahead of me, and that's just fine. But equally interesting to me is how the new discipline, in this case photography, has also strongly affected my design work, and I want to show how the two start to work with each other. So understand this presentation has to be a speedy one. I'll give you a little background, I'll give you a sense of my process, and some highlights of the results. But if anything here interests you and you want to learn more about anything specific, tomorrow afternoon's workshop will be a chance to look at any aspect of this in more depth, including the emotional turmoil of working while not knowing, which is something I really can't get into here, but it's an important factor in all of this. So let's start with my studio, because how I set it up has everything to do with my working method. My last studio was located above an auto repair shop in what was then a very uncool part of San Francisco. It is definitely not very welcoming on the outside. But I came to love the grittiness of the neighborhood because visitors to my studio would arrive somewhat uneasy, as you can imagine, going through that beige door and then up these stairs, but then their faces would light up when they saw this. Ah, yes. And this is what my studio looked like. It was a controlled frenzy of energy. Now, I've got to confess that this studio does not exist anymore, but for the sake of this talk, let's pretend it does. It'll just make the talk work a lot better. But one thing to notice the structure and the order here, and everything that I do, and it's reflected right there, is always a balance between a loose grid, an organization, and the slippage of that grid. So it's those two things pushing against each other. So first, let's look at the public display that I have in the studio. I collect a lot of things, and I enjoy having them on display, even if I'm the only audience. So this is how visitors were greeted when they walked in. I like the objects to start to feel like they have their own lives and they start to have relationships with each other. That is really important to me, is how the objects work together. And again, that has everything to do with how I do the work that I do. I like the objects to seem to gather around and find their own tribe, their own colleagues, and so that it starts to feel natural. They've managed to kind of drift towards each other, kind of like people do. And I like it when the relationship seems to build themselves. These connections will change over time. I was in this space for about 6 years. So when a new purchase enters in, at first it's confused. It doesn't know where to go. It's like the new kid at school. But eventually they find their space, they find their friends, and then they start working with each other. Now, I'll look at the private side of my studio, which are the archives. I have about 30 notebooks like this that are filled with remnants of 3 decades of design work. I don't throw anything out. I use these pages over and over again. They get in and out of order. What I kind of like is the semblance of order. The fact that they're all 3-hole punched and they're put into binders gives me the idea of order. But every time I take a page out and work with it, I put it back somewhere else. So it's constantly shuffling and constantly changing. When I do collage work, I work very slowly and by hand, and so I'll keep this page until almost every letter is gone. And I like that over time, the pages beneath start to get revealed, and so things start to shift and kind of erode and grow into each other. I also collect a lot of paper ephemera. Been collecting it for many, many years, ever since I was a little kid, actually. And again, because there's no real order, I can't simply look up a topic like California, for example. And that is a problem when I need to find something specific. But that's not usually how I work. I usually am just thinking about a project and just start flipping through because I like the unexpected connections to happen. And so there are photos, postcards, scraps. These are all parts of my working materials, and like I said, I flip through these at the beginning of almost every project. Now let's go back to my studio, and if you remember the view I showed you, if you turn 180 degrees around, this is what you'll see. This is in the other direction. As you'll see, this is a looser structure because this is a collection of bits and pieces from projects, things that I found, some things that I found on the street. It's a lot more irregular forms. So there are some rules, but in general, the objects seem to form their own connections, and that's what I like. So it's a balance between an imposed order that I give it and an organic, self-generated order. I look at this as not chaos, but fun. Here's a detail. So you can see how all these different materials and things just start to live together. And again, none of these individual pieces matter that much to me, but it's how they all come together that becomes really important. Now, in 2014, I was invited to create a similar kind of thing at the Adobe San Francisco office. It was a bit of a challenge. They came into my studio and were really taken with the wall, and I just bet that I could recreate it in another space. So here I am. I dragged all those notebooks, all those boxes of ephemera with me, and this is in the front hall at Adobe. I worked on it for about 5 days and nights, working mostly at night and weekends because then the employees aren't there. So these are just the boxes I'm using at the moment. There's a whole other room that was just filled with all of that stuff. I just brought it all over with me. And here's the result. It runs 5 feet tall by 30 feet wide, and it was installed there in Adobe for about 6 months. Some details. So you can see everything is held up by push pins, and I need to mention push pins are my go-to object. It's the most important supply I have in my studio. And once again, these objects are finding their own territories, their own spaces, and that's again how I like to work. So I build it up slowly and intuitively, and I try to find out how to partner these things together. I titled this "Drops from a Faucet into a Pool," and the reasoning for that, the idea of order, like when water goes through a faucet, it's in a constructed order that we give it. Once it comes out of the faucet into a pool, it finds its own order. And I look at my design work very much like that. It's a relationship between a constructed order that we give it and the natural order that it wants to find. Now let's go back to the studio and look at yet another wall. This one is covered with a much tighter structure of photos, a grid there. Now these were all studies and tests from design projects that I've done over the years. Here's a detail, so you can see push pins again. These are from about 25, 30 years of work when I was using photography as part of my natural way of doing design. And I've always liked to create abstractions shot from real materials, and that began way back when I designed Speak magazine in the mid-90s. Generally, I would do that in like the table of contents pages because I didn't have to worry about meaning or relationship to a text. It could just be a way of bringing in these kinds of pages together. But at this time and all around this, all my photography was done in service of a client, never just for myself. The first non-Speak magazine client I did this for was for Reebok. I did the graphics for a massive trade show booth in Atlanta. These are some of the original photographs that I took when I was just testing things out. And it's a little hard to see, but they all are mixed in. This is one of the walls there at the trade show. But this is a way of starting to do that for clients specifically, is work with my own photography in relationship to that. Now, a lot of these photos and things come from another thing that I collect, which are bits and pieces of old machine parts, go to hardware stores, usually junk shops. I really like to disassemble appliances, find broken toys, sometimes that are just left out on the street, and I keep these bits and pieces to use in my photographs, again, primarily for client-based work. I have over 50 bins like this with plastic, glass, wood, paper, and I continue to take machines apart all the time and find new exciting pieces to catalog, inventory, and use. Here's a quick example. If we go back to this original image here, and if you look in the back, that is a 1997 Canon PC-850 plain paper copier. I bought it for my very first studio, and we have been best friends ever since. Here's a closer look. So you see it definitely has a pride of place in the studio there. Very important to me. But unfortunately, earlier this year, it stopped working. And not that it wasn't like repairable, it was just that no more parts are made for this 1997 copier. So there's nothing I could do to get it repaired. Now, one of the problems is this thing is heavy, and this thing is bulky, and there was no easy, inexpensive way to get rid of it. It was just too heavy. So I decided to disassemble it just to get enough of the pieces down to a size where I can move it out the door. But once I started taking off the outer shell, I was pretty astonished with the number of parts and the complexity that was inside of it. So I decided to start dissecting it very carefully. I was just fascinated with the number of pieces. This is the first set of pieces. This is my dining room table because I'm now working out of my apartment. So this is just the first round of pieces. There were hundreds of parts. And now all of these parts have become part of my collection and are working their way into my work. So it's kind of interesting how the machine, by kind of dissolving it into parts, I didn't have to get rid of it at all. It just became a new source of more material. And much of the machine still hasn't even been completely taken apart yet. There's so many parts to it. And this is all just to make plain copies. And so there's just this wonderland of pieces and engineering that went into that I really love. Now, this is my photo room. This is actually in my apartment now. Now, the camera is always set up. The lights are always in place and ready. There's a whole series of light tables right under the materials there. And to me, this is critically important. So if I can give you any advice, it would be if you want to ever work in these kinds of media with this kind of material, you need to have the stuff ready and on hand and accessible. Because as soon as there's an impasse, as soon as like, oh, I'm going to have to drag the camera out and set up the lights, you won't do it. You'll find another way. So I have a room that is just set up for this. All the materials are there. And what I really like is when the materials start to land on each other. So as you see, it's not an antiseptic place at all. There are all kinds of different bits and pieces, and it's the kind of inadvertent relationship or accidental overlap between the objects and light that I find really exciting, and it leads to unexpected results, where disorder leads to a new order. These are the kind of pictures that I would take in this room. So this is just working with very simple materials, just pieces of acetate and plastic, nothing special, actually. And so I do this a lot just to test out visual ideas. These are actually quite simple. Now, one thing is I'm not particularly interested in these as individual photographs. They don't really matter to me by themselves, but it's how I start to mass them together, like you saw on the walls. That becomes important to me. Now, a friend of mine, John Sueda, who's also the chair of the program where I teach, he was curating a show called All Possible Futures, and he visited my studio just to get some of my design work to be in the show. And we jokingly said, wouldn't it be kind of fun if you recreated one of these walls in a gallery setting? I had never done that before, but I agreed to do it as a challenge, but on the condition that all the photographs, everything that I do for it has to be new. I wasn't going to just take things off the wall and put it in a new place. I was going to create all new work for it. So to prepare, I shot over 2,000 photos, and I created the whole work on site. I had never done that before. None of the photography was ever shown in a curated space, in a gallery space. But here I am. Here's the beginning. The only thing I knew was that that large piece that you just saw the image of was going to be the first thing down. Everything else I was just going to do right there on site. I didn't know what was going to happen, but I find it the idea of this being a tension between a project and a game, sort of. It was a challenge to myself. What can I make it work? I didn't know what was going to happen, but here I am putting all of this up. It took about a week of installing. It was slow. You put a lot of things up, take a lot of things down. There's the finished piece in the gallery, all held up with push pins again. So that's just a freestanding wall covered with homosote and the push pins. Here's a detail. Now, I'm going to jump ahead about a year and a half. There were some really important projects between this project and where I'm going to land, and we can talk about that tomorrow if you want. But I don't have time to go through it all, so let's just say I haven't stopped doing that. I started to use the exact same process of pinning up photographs onto board, but instead of working with installations, I'm starting to do this to create individual prints. I'm working with overlap, I'm working with scale, I'm starting to loosen the structure, but there are still definitely rules in place. So this would be a typical pinup, this would be the image that came from it. And this started to really interest me. And you notice that I removed color from it. Again, I can explain all of that tomorrow about why I did that. I haven't given up color. I've just used it for very specific things. I started to make these larger and larger. In this case, this is 4 feet by 4 feet. And it just started to grow from here. So this is, again, the pinup in my studio. And this is the final image. So you can see that even here, it's how the pieces come together. I'm putting this up and treating them as just the way I treated the objects in my office. So this thing that I've always liked to do becomes a part of the process of this new body of work. Now, this whole series is called The New Machinery. That's the name of this ongoing series. I use that, it's somewhat in tribute to the original machines these came from, and also the kind of machine-like process and the machine-like result that these suggest. Now, also notice the reality of the rectangle of the photograph. If you saw way back when, I always had to deal with the rectangles, and the grid was always based on the rectangle of the piece of paper of the photograph. I still do that, and by pinning it up, I'm forced to reckon with the fact that these are pieces of paper that either overlap or underlap each other. And that becomes very important. And again, it's between the structure that's imposed, which is the rectangle, and a kind of natural organic structure where in places the images just start to flow into each other. These are some very recent ones. These are just from earlier this year. So it keeps evolving as I keep getting new materials to bring in, and they keep looking for new ways to make this work. I started adding this gray cloth because I like the idea of starting to think of this as a theater and as a stage, and it also starts to suggest a placement for the viewer. The viewer is on one side of the curtain, these performing forms are on another side. And so these ways of thinking about it are definitely within the photographic realm of thinking more than a design realm of thinking. And so this all became very interesting to me. Here's a detail. Then you can see the edges where the two pictures come together, and that's totally fine. This is the last one that I've done. This was from spring. I really like the way this starts to feel almost like the magician's table, where one thing is levitating above and the other pieces are on the ground below. Here's the levitated piece. And here's a detail of the other objects and the cloth. So while all this is going on, I get a commission to design a series of large panels for a corporate headquarters in Oakland. As I said at the beginning, I don't plan these things. It's not like I started to look at corporate offices as a place to do my work. They just contacted me out of the blue. It was very, very strange, and I didn't take it seriously at first. But here I go again. And I use the hexagon as a point of departure because it is an element that is featured throughout the office in tile, in furniture, fabrics, and floors. So I started photographing using the shape just like I would any other material. I had to shoot about 6,000 pictures just to get myself ready. And here is the workroom that I spent the entire summer a year and a half ago. All these panels were 6.5 feet tall. I created them all at actual scale. I pieced them together by hand, and then I had to recreate them digitally because in the office they couldn't have push pins holding this up. So it took several rounds of creating and then recreating. I did them all simultaneously, all the panels. This was for an entire wall of a conference room. It ran 21 feet long, and this was in a much tighter gridded structure of the hexagons. Here's the final piece. So this is along a whole wall in a conference room. And here's a detail. So you can see the hexagon figures in here, but it isn't exclusive. So again, it's part the prescribed kind of order and organization. Everything will have a hexagon, but then it shifts and drops and other things find their way into it. So there is a kind of looseness along with the rigor. And that's how I really like to work. Once again, it goes all the way back to the beginning. Here are some other of the final panels. Now, every floor was a different level of seeing. This was the lowest floor, so this dealt with the subway. That was actually, there was a BART station beneath the building, the office building. So a lot of these photographs were taken in BART, looking at the tiles and the signage and the trains themselves. This was one of the highest ones, so this was looking up at the sky. There are windows all the way around the offices, and so a lot of these were shot right out their windows, and then take those views and put it through a kaleidoscope, and this is what you get. And this is what it looks like when it's installed. So they're all right next to windows, and so you have the window looking outward, and then this strange kaleidoscopic reworking of the view right outside. Again, some details. You can see, again, the rectangles are right there. I don't hide that fact. That becomes an important component of it. This is from the BART station, the signage. And there's our friend, the hexagon again. So my design work has influenced how I work with the camera. I'm using a lot of design principles in how I photograph and how I put the photographs together. But it has worked the other way too. My photo projects have started to influence my graphic design work. In the very first project that I tried this with, because I didn't know that it was going to work. So I said, let's give this a try. It was for a cover of the journal Design Issues. And it was their 100th anniversary issue. And so they asked, just include the number 100 somewhere on the cover. So, okay, I printed out 100 in lots of different fonts, and I started using it like a material, like I did with the hexagon. And these are just some of the images that I shot. In this case, I shot about 500 images, and just using the materials that I have on hand, seeing what would happen. And then, like everything else, I did the pinup. Now, to me, this analog part of the process of working with the actual print is critical. It keeps me honest. I'm not allowed to blow things up. I'm not allowed to put things on slight angles. I just have to deal with the actual pieces of paper. So this is the construction, and then here is the back cover, spine, and front cover of the finished print. Another project I did was for a landscape architect in San Francisco, and they're primarily urban landscapers working within cities, so they're often working in small spaces between buildings. I decided to try this again. In this case, I'm using wire and architectural glass But the results that I would get from this have nothing to do with wire or glass. Instead, it's about rhythm and motion. It's about abstracting these forms, so using these dumb materials to create this kind of thing that I could never have sketched out. And that's another part of this, is designing the process, not the result, but just keeping your eyes open to the result. Here's another setup, again with glass and wire. And in this case, you get fluid and flowing rhythms going on. So it references water and flow, but I didn't use water in this case. And here are just a bunch of copper pipes that I have in the studio. And they then ultimately reference architecture. So architecture, repetition, construction, all of these things started to work together. And I pinned all of this up and created this large image, from which then came the whole identity system. This was the master palette that is now hanging in their office. This is along a whole wall, and then pieces of this come out to form the individual projects that are part of the identity system. So in this case, this is the letterhead, the front and the back. These are business cards. And it continues to evolve. There were many, many both print and digital pieces, all of which taking components from that original master. This past spring, a fellow San Francisco designer, Jean-Benoit Lévy, invited me to collaborate with him on a poster commemorating the 50th anniversary of the Apollo moon landing. And so I was curious about, could this process now work within a collaborative situation? I always was doing this on my own. And so I decided to work with, I made some new images. Some of these are old images. This is just a rough construction. I would take this rough construction, I would send it to him, the image of it. He would move things around, and we went back and forth a bunch of times. Ultimately, he added type and information, and this became the final poster, which is printed in black and silver silkscreen. And I was really pleased with how it worked, and it started to reflect both of our ways of working. And as a final project to show you, Josh Berger and Nico Cortelis from the Portland Stamp Company invited me to design some of their artist stamps. You may know them and the stamps that they've been creating. And so I decided, let's go to the raw material again. They sent me a bunch of blanks, perforated blanks, and I decided to say, can I use these just like I would use any of the other materials? And so I just started folding them up and damaging them a little bit, and then begin photographing. And in a sense, this was almost like investigating the secret lives of perforations, just seeing what would happen between them and light and motion. And these were all studies that I did. And these are mock-ups of the first set of stamp sheets, and they're being printed right now. Hopefully they'll be actually available by the end of the year. And I like now how the play with perforations are on a page where there are actual perforations, and the relationship between the real and the physical and the image of them, I think, makes for an interesting artifact in the end. So this shift between design and photography, and then photography back into design, this kind of steering that I called it, has injected a whole new way of thinking and creating in my work. All of this stuff is very new to me, and it makes me feel almost like I'm starting all over again, which is really exciting at my age. It's taken a huge amount of work, a huge amount of discipline and self-critique, all of which I can get into tomorrow and discuss that. But the important point is that it is a new chapter in my life, and it builds upon all the things I love doing ever since I was a kid. Thank you very much.